Hello, this is the 6th video in the AutoIt scripting tutorial video set, and in this video I'm going to cover something called loops. A loop is a way of running a section of your scripting code a set number of times, or a dynamic number of times, depending on how your script is and how many times something needs to run. Because it saves you from having to paste the same piece of code 4,000 times. You can just have a loop that will run 4,000 times if that's what you need. There are 3 different kinds of loops. There's a do loop, a while loop, and a for loop. Now, a do loop, what this does is it automatically will go through the entire loop at least once. And then at the end of the loop it will check some value or something to find out if it needs to run again. So what I'm going to do here, the first thing it will do is make a message box, and it will show us what's in this first variable that I made. That's the first thing that this loop will do. And then I'm going to plus equals 1 to this variable, so when it reaches the end it will plus 1. So with like you do with any other multi-line function, like an if-then ending it with end if, you have to end this do loop, and the way you do that is by using until, and then we put our check in. So we can say until first equals 5. Now, here it starts out being 1 and shows us where it is right now, and then it adds 1 to it. So let's see what happens. F5. Okay, the first time it's 1, right? So now once I press the OK on here, it's going to add 1 to it. Now it's 2, now it's 3, now it's 4, and it stopped at 4. Now why did it stop at 4? Why didn't it wait until it reached 5? Well, the reason is because it starts off at 1, it shows us where it is right now, and then it adds 1 to itself, and then this thing is checking it. So that's why we start out, it's 1, then it adds 1 to it, then it becomes 2, and then 3, and then 4, so this will show us 4, this adds 1 to itself, and then this becomes now 5. We don't see it yet because it hasn't looped through to show us using the message box. So even though that this just showed us it's 4, this adds 1 extra 1 onto the first variable, and now when this check happens it sees that this variable actually means 5, and it stops. So it won't loop anymore. So the reason why a do loop is useful is because it will always do everything inside of it at least once and then check to see if a condition is met. And these conditions could be any of the kinds of operators that I showed you before using if-then. So you could say until first is greater than 5, or until first is lower than 2. So you can choose, or until first doesn't equal 5, which this will only cycle through once because it is 1 and it isn't 5. So it's going to end right as soon as it's gotten through to the end of it, because this, even after we've run it the first time, this would become 2. Because it was 1 to begin with, then it added 1 to itself, and it says until first doesn't equal 5. Well, 2 is not 5. So it cancels itself out and doesn't do any more after the first time that it ran. The next kind of loop is a while loop. And this is similar to the do loop in the sense that it's the exact opposite. Now it's similar because they do cycle through, because it is a loop, but instead of checking at the end to see if it needs to run again, it checks at the beginning to see if it needs to run, and it will check that condition. So we can still have it looping, but it will only start and continue to go as long as a certain condition is met. So with this, we start it off with while, and then we can give it a variable. While first doesn't equal 5. Now, similarly, what we will do is we'll do a message box. So now we have a message box that will show us the variable. So to start with, the variable is going to be 1, which meets this criteria of not being 5. So what I shall do here is what we did before, a plus equals 1. Now, just like the do loop that you have to end with until, the while loop has an end because it's a multi-line function, and this one is w end. So let's see what this does. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it stops because we're saying while first doesn't equal 5, and just like on the other one, where we are right now it will show us, but then just before it ends it adds 1 to it. So even though this is showing us number 4, this then adds 1 to itself, so now technically it's 5, and then when it cycles through to the beginning to check, this actually does equal 5. So it does not meet the criteria of being not the same as 5, because it actually is 5. So that's why when we run this, we only see up to the number 4, because as soon as it's done that 4 message, it adds 1, and now it's broken the criteria, and it cannot run anymore. So that's the while loop. It's useful because whereas the do loop always works at least once, sometimes you might not want something to happen at all because a certain condition hasn't been met. So with this, if I say here, if I start this out as being a 5, when I run this, it doesn't do anything because while first doesn't equal 5. So the only way that this while loop is going to cycle through and do everything that's inside of it is if whatever this value is, it can't be 5. And since I just set it as 5, it didn't run at all. So with this I was able to prevent it from doing anything because I didn't need it to do anything right now. Later in the script it might be 6 or something, so therefore it would actually work. And this is going to go forever because the criteria is that it has to not be 5. So since I started it at 6, it's actually going to go forever. So how you stop something, if you do a loop that overruns something and you maybe typed something wrong and it's just seeming to go on forever, you can stop forcibly a script by clicking Tools and hitting Stop Executing. And as you can see, the dialogue for it, the icon just disappeared. So that's your while loop. It won't run if a condition isn't met, and it will go on forever until that condition is met. So that's that. Actually, we don't even need a variable for this one. So the other kind of the loop, the third loop that is available for you to use, is called a for loop. And a for loop, whereas a comparison with the do loop does everything inside it and then checks to see if it runs again. The while loop checks to see if it needs to run at all and will keep running until that condition is broken. The for loop, by comparison, runs a set number of times. So it'll go through the first time, the second time, the third time, and then stop because it's set in stone. So what we need to do here is we need to start a variable, and we're going to call this A. We don't need to declare this because it's just internal. It's only used for the purposes of what's inside and the operation of this for loop. It doesn't get used anywhere else. So we go for A equals 1 to 5. So what we're saying here is we want to kickstart $A as being 1, and we want to go to number 5. So it'll stop as soon as it reaches 5. Now by default, it only goes up in increments of 1. So when it cycles through, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, end. Now if we wanted to, we can change that. Let's say we wanted to go up to 10. We could make it go up manually in increments of 1. So it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Or we could make it go up in increments of 2. Depending on how we want to do the script, we might need that. We might need to be able to count up in increments of 2. But for our little demonstration here, I'm going to keep it simple and just say we want to go from 1 to 5. So I'm going to do a message box. And we're going to show you what's inside A. Now, again, since this is a multi-line function, we need to end the for loop. And the way we do that is next. Because we want to run this whole thing a set number of times, and then what comes after it is next. So down here we could type extra things. So when we run this now with F5, it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it stops, because it always runs 5 times. Okay? So a for loop is very useful because you know it's going to run a certain number of times, because it's going from this to this. So you could be able to get a piece of information from an external source, maybe the number of lines in a file or something, and you would be able to use a variable here to go from 1 to whatever number of lines it is. Maybe you've got a variable that has those number of lines in it. So if I go here and go first equals 5, I could actually go from 1 to first, and this will do the same exact thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we can put a variable in here. We could have a different variable. We could go first to second. So I can put first as being 1, second as being 5, and so now A equals first, which is here, so that's technically going to equal 1, so it's going to go from first until it reaches second. So it's going to go from 1 to 5, so it still does the same thing even though we didn't specify it. 5, and then it ends. And we'll continue with the script, which obviously for demonstration purposes I don't have a full script. So there are your loops and why they're useful. Just as a quick recap, a do loop always does everything inside of it until a condition is met. A while loop is going to check right from the get-go, right from the very beginning, and if the condition is broken or met, depending on how you've phrased it, it will either run at all or it won't run at all. So if I've done a while loop of while a variable doesn't equal 5, well, if a is 17, that isn't 5, so it will work. But if I had a as being 5, it's like while a doesn't equal 5. Well, if it does equal 5, then it broke the criteria, so it won't work at all. So that's really useful, because we can have something not work, we can have it not do anything until the time is right. A for loop is for when something is designed to be a certain number of times. Now, whether you set that number of times in your script manually, or whether you use variables like we're doing here to dynamically choose how many times based on something else that happened in the script. So that is how you can loop things multiple times, and they are very crucial. You'll use loops probably a great deal in your scripts. So that was video 6, and I shall see you in video 7.